Hi, my name's Frances Clay, and I am the link teacher for Kingsway Park High School on the Rochdale Additional Needs Service Neurodivergent Outreach Team for Education Support, or RANS Notes for short. And I've been asked to speak to you today about supporting students with social communication difficulties in a mainstream high school. My background is that I'm a secondary French teacher, and before I moved to work at RANS 2 years ago, I taught at Matthew Moss High School, where I was also SENCO. So firstly, the aim of this training is to enable mainstream secondary teachers to support students facing social communication difficulties more effectively. Participants will develop an understanding of what social communication difficulties are, how they affect student engagement and learning, be able to identify key signs of social communication difficulties to better support students in the classroom, and have a range of actionable strategies to help adapt teaching and learning for students with social communication difficulties. So first of all, section 1, understanding social communication difficulties. So there are 3 elements to social communication. First of all, verbal communication. So the actual words that are being used, the vocabulary that's being chosen, the register of that language, whether it's formal or informal. And then non-verbal communication. So facial expression, body language, tone of voice, intonation, gesture. And then thirdly, pragmatic language use within social contexts, which refers to how we adapt the verbal and non-verbal communication we choose to use in order to communicate appropriately in a particular social context. So within a classroom context, there are some unwritten rules around socially appropriate use of language, and children's awareness of those develops with age. So for example, a secondary age pupil putting their hand up to give an answer to a question would be appropriate within that context, but people putting their hand up to tell a 5-minute story about their pet hamster would be perceived at that age as inappropriate for that social context, unless it was in some way relevant to that part of the lesson or that question. Students with social communication difficulties might struggle to understand not just the language that's being used, but also to interpret tone of voice, body language, facial expression, and implied meanings. So, for example, if a child is tapping a pen on the desk and the teacher uses their name, points to the pen, the implied meaning is obviously, please stop tapping, but they might have that difficulty in understanding that's what's being asked of them. So sometimes the behaviour of children with social communication difficulties can come across as defiant or rude when it actually stems from misunderstanding or misinterpreting social cues or implied meanings. So what sort of behaviours might we identify that suggest there are some underlying social communication difficulties? First of all, children might interpret the meaning of language in a very literal way. So when I was teaching, I once said to a child, just hold your horses, and he spent the rest of the lesson completely confused about where horses came into any of this, why it was relevant to what we were learning about. He was trying to find a picture of a horse on the page, thinking it was something to do with that. He had no idea what I was asking him to do and didn't know what the alternate meaning of that phrase was. So when you're using idioms or any non-literal language, it may need to be explained in a more literal way so that it's understood accurately. And it's probably best to use that sort of language sparingly so that it doesn't dominate the lesson, and the concepts that you want to be teaching can be at the forefront rather than having to explain any non-literal idioms and expressions throughout the lesson. Because of the challenges faced by children with social communication difficulties, group learning activities can be really tricky. They might struggle to know when to contribute, how much to contribute, and either dominate the group task or sit back passively and just let others do the task and let them get on with it. Because they're sometimes not sure how to get involved and how to interject with their ideas. They might also struggle with knowing how to appropriately disagree with someone's point. So if they don't think their idea is any good, being able to do that politely can be a challenge, and finding the words to say, I don't think we should do that, how about we do this instead, can be difficult. And so it might come out as, that's a stupid idea, when they're not meaning to offend somebody, they just have only that language to put their point across. Because of their difficulties with social communication, lots of children tend to develop a coping strategy of talking about their preferred interests and can be very articulate when it comes to a subject that they know a lot about, but can end up talking off topic because that topic's interested them and not adhering to those rules of that to and fro conversation where you listen and respond in line with what the other person has said. Sometimes interrupting others, not allowing others to have their say within the conversation. They can often misunderstand things like sarcasm, and very frequently children with social communication difficulties report that when their friends make jokes, they don't always understand what they mean. Students with social communication difficulties struggle to process verbal language and so can encounter difficulties in understanding instructions, understanding the concepts that are being covered, and so we're not always able to engage fully in lessons. Because of those comprehension difficulties, they then fail to retain new information from teacher input, and that can lead to a massive impact on their learning and progress. In social situations, these students are often the ones who face some isolation. They're less likely to form positive peer relationships. They're more likely to experience bullying or to perceive that they're being bullied because of misunderstanding another person's meanings and motivations and what they're saying to them. They struggle to interact in a way that would be socially inappropriate at times. So they're more likely to have high levels of anxiety because of their knowledge that sometimes what they're saying isn't coming across how they intend it to be said. Now, the most crucial part, what is there that can help and support these students in the classroom? So the first thing to think about is your own communication. Is it clear and direct? Could it easily be misinterpreted or misunderstood? Things like instructions for the lesson or complex concepts within the curriculum broken down sufficiently into smaller, more manageable chunks of learning, where there's time to process the language and make sense of it before moving on. Using visuals, practical demonstrations, diagrams, checklists, any other visual support that reinforces the verbal language being used are a great help. So when we say something, we only give that one chance for it to be processed and understood, whereas if there's a more permanent written form of the same instruction or piece of information, it allows pupils to be able to check back to that point of reference, and if there are elements that have been forgotten or missed or misunderstood, it gives that additional processing time and to do that before moving on and can help make sense of the language. Checking pupils' understanding is really key. Very often as teachers we ask, have you understood all that? And often we get the stock response of yes, whereas if we switch that question to, can you explain back to me those instructions, or can you explain back to me what I've just taught you? By hearing their interpretation of what's being said, those misconceptions can be more easily identified and ironed out. So something as simple as this just acts as that visual support, that more permanent point of reference after the verbal instructions are given. I went on a course years ago when I was still teaching at Matthew Moss about supporting children with autism, and this was one of the things that I introduced in my classroom. Just always having a running checklist of the activities that we were working through, including some of the classroom expectations like coming in, taking your coat off, getting your equipment out. And I always had that as a little point of reference. And what I discovered was that actually everyone in the class was using it. It wasn't just children who were struggling with social communication. Sometimes it was me using it when I'd forgotten what I'd asked them to do. And the other thing I noticed was that children were getting through more activities in the lesson because they weren't having to wait for me to come over and tell them what to move on to next. They weren't spending time or their cognitive load on retaining and recalling instructions. They could just focus on the content of the lesson. So in my case, the bits of French that I wanted them to learn that lesson. So it might be that some of those visual supports focus on the pragmatics of social language. So what is socially appropriate within particular parts of the lesson. So here it's during the teacher input, what might indicate that you're listening, what classroom expectations there are so that everyone is available to listen, and not just what it should look like on the outside, but also what should your brain be doing. So a reminder that it's not just about the appearance of listening whilst thinking about something else, but the reminder that you should also be taking in the information and processing it, and that your brain has an important role to play in listening as well. Giving examples of what you want the work to look like can really help to reduce the amount of language that is necessary for pupils to process. Just this very simple layout on the left here would still take quite a bit of explaining. So I'd like you to write the title and date on the top line, underline both of those, leave a line, then write numbers 1 to 6 down the left hand side of the page, leaving a line between each one. So that verbal explanation requires pupils to process what's being said, understand it, and then translate each part of it into practical action. Whereas just being able to see the visual, know exactly what's expected, is much more efficient. On the right hand side, there's this more complicated example of a visual support that shows how the piece of writing should be made up of 3 different paragraphs containing different elements of information. Also gives us an idea of what length it should be, which again is something that children with social communication difficulties often struggle with. So this is entitled A Birthday to Remember. So they might potentially just write the one when I was 9, because they're more likely to have missed some implied meanings about the extent to which this needs to be described in detail. Alternatively, they potentially go into too much detail because they're not sure what details are appropriate to communicate within the story and what things can be left out. The more classroom and whole school routines that are predictable, consistent and familiar to students, the less need for lots of processing of new language is required. I've put a picture of a science practical on here because I was once observing a science lesson where the teacher said, right, demonstration time, and within about 10 seconds, the whole class moved silently into position, ready to observe the demonstration. And my first thought was, wow, this class are really well behaved, but they were actually just very well trained. I then noticed that there was masking tape in different colours on the floor, and they all had their spot to stand on and knew exactly where they were expected to be. So not only did it reduce the amount the teacher needed to say in giving the instruction, it also supported children with social communication difficulties in that they weren't having to negotiate a spot round the table. They didn't have to say, could you just move to the side a bit, please, your head's in the way, or oh, do you mind if I just squeeze in here between you two? Because that's a challenge to be able to express that in a socially appropriate way. And instead what often comes out is move, maybe even a bit of a shove, and that can then lead to those difficulties with peer interactions where they might be perceived as being rude, whereas actually it's not having the language to be able to do that in a way that's polite. Obviously then when those routines change, this needs to be communicated carefully in a way that's really clear, direct and comprehensible. So things like visual timetables being used can often help with that. If it's, for example, careers day in school, sometimes a few days before, the form tutor might tell students, so on Thursday, we'll go down to the hall between break and lunch in lessons 3 and 4, we'll do X, Y and Z, then you go for lunch at this time, head straight to the dinner hall then. Instead of that verbal explanation, just having that visual that shows what the new routine is going to look like on that day, and it can save lots of need for processing the explanation and then retaining it and recalling it on the day. Sometimes children are shown the layout of the timetable for a day, but then don't have that permanent point of reference with them to check back on in the moment when they've forgotten what the instruction was from the day before. So giving them something, a visual timetable, visual support to take away and use at the relevant time is a really good way to support. In group learning tasks, a really easy way to give clear expectations of what each person should be doing and give the social skills support is about giving out different job roles within the task so that children have an area that's their responsibility, and then the social expectations around that become a little bit clearer. Might also start off with teaching some of the social norms around group work, which can also help. For example, things like not to be rude or dismissive about other people's ideas, encouraging others to contribute, allowing everyone to be able to contribute and share their ideas. So this idea of sort of share the air, contribute your own ideas, give feedback to others in a way that is kind, helpful, polite, but specific about what you think of that idea. Here are some examples of the roles that could be given out in a group learning task. So, for example, the leader has the job of explaining the project goal to other group members. They make sure everyone understands their role and identifies which tasks will be done within that session. So you might also accompany this with language scaffolds as well. So things like, Bob, your role is to do whatever. Is that what you understand your role to be? Or I think our task for today's session should be whatever. Is there anyone who thinks we should be doing something different today? So that you're feeding them ideas of how the language they use within that role, within that social context might sound. So thinking about those strategies, be great if you could go away from this with just one idea of something that you might be able to implement this week that would help children with social communication difficulties access your lessons more easily. So visual support you might start using, a classroom routine that's going to become embedded, or a way of checking that the verbal language within the lesson has been processed and understood. Like I said at the beginning, I'm the link teacher for Kingsway within the RANS notes team. I come into your school around 4 to 5 times per term. So if you ever want to have a chat with me about a particular learner, how best to meet their needs, or about a particular class or a learning activity that you've planned, then just speak to your Senko and I'm sure that we can arrange a good time to meet and discuss that. Or to come in and observe a lesson if that's what you prefer. So my contact details are here. If you want to get in touch, if you have any questions or anything, feel free to do that. Thank you very much for listening today. Have a good week. Goodbye.